Dearest listeners, how peculiar it is that those blessed with the keenest sight often prove the blindest in matters of the heart. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of a duke who sought love in 12 drawing rooms, whilst it waited patiently in his own study. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Montrose House in Grosvenor Square as Miss Georgiana Sinclair arranged the Duke of Montrose's correspondence with her customary precision. 5 years had passed since she first entered these hallowed halls, a merchant's daughter with an exceptional education and a desperate need for employment following her father's untimely demise. The position of secretary to His Grace had been unconventional, certainly. Ladies of gentle birth did not typically engage in such employment, and those of lower station rarely possessed the necessary accomplishments. Yet Georgiana existed in that peculiar space between worlds, too educated for service, too poor for society, perfectly suited for the unique requirements of a duke who valued competence above convention. Her father, Edmund Sinclair, had been that rare creature, a merchant with scholarly inclinations who had invested his modest fortune not in expanding his trade, but in educating his only child. He had engaged tutors typically reserved for the sons of nobility, ensuring Georgiana could speak French and Italian with perfect accent, understood Latin and Greek well enough to read the classics in their original form, and possessed a mathematical mind that could balance ledgers with startling efficiency. When consumption claimed him during her 20th year, he left her with an education worth a fortune and actual money worth almost nothing. The morning routine at Montrose House followed patterns as precise as the movements of celestial bodies. The servants rose before dawn, preparing the great house for another day of ducal magnificence. By the time Georgiana arrived at her desk, an elegant piece of rosewood positioned to catch the morning light while remaining appropriately distant from the Duke's massive mahogany workspace. The fires had been lit, the post sorted, and the tea service arranged exactly as His Grace preferred. Christopher Montrose, the 9th Duke of his line, entered his study with the particular brand of controlled frustration that had become his signature in recent months. At 31, he possessed the sort of severe handsomeness that might have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and austere lines, softened only occasionally by a smile that few had witnessed. His dark hair, always impeccably arranged by his valet with a precious pomade in the Parisian style, obtained through considerable difficulty and expense during these years of conflict with France, caught the morning light as he moved to his desk where Georgiana had already laid out the morning's priorities. The study itself reflected its master's character, imposing yet functional, with towering bookcases containing volumes on everything from agricultural management to ancient philosophy. The collection had been accumulated over generations, each duke adding volumes that reflected their particular interests. The current duke's contributions leaned heavily toward scientific advancement and agricultural innovation, practical tomes that promised improved yields and revolutionary farming techniques. The desk, a massive piece of mahogany that had served 6 previous dukes, dominated the room's center. Here, the business of one of England's greatest estates was conducted with mechanical precision, every detail scrutinized, every decision weighed with careful deliberation. She observed him from beneath lowered lashes, a practice perfected over years of silent devotion. The set of his shoulders spoke volumes. Another rejection, then. Lady Clarissa Pemberton, if her calculations proved correct. The 11th young lady of impeccable breeding to refuse the honor of becoming the Duchess of Montrose. Each rejection followed a predictable pattern. The Duke would return from whatever carefully orchestrated romantic scene he had created, his composure intact but his bewilderment palpable. He would throw himself into estate work with increased vigor, as if mathematical precision in crop rotation could somehow explain the inexplicable arithmetic of the heart. The ton whispered about it incessantly. These failed proposals that had become something of a sensation during the current season. At Almack's, that temple of social exclusivity, the patronesses discussed it over orgeat and tea cakes. In the card rooms at White's, gentlemen placed wagers on which young lady would next refuse the increasingly notorious Duke. How could any young lady refuse such a match? The Duke of Montrose commanded one of the oldest titles in England, possessed a fortune that rivaled Croesus, maintained estates that sprawled across 3 counties, and cut a figure that caused debutantes to flutter their fans with increased vigor whenever he entered a ballroom. Yet, refuse him, they did, one after another, each citing variations of the same concern. His grace appeared incapable of the tenderness required for matrimonial harmony. The whispers had taken on a life of their own in the fashionable drawing rooms of Mayfair. Matrons speculated over tea about what fundamental flaw could cause such universal rejection. Some suggested a hidden cruelty. Others wondered about scandals carefully concealed. The more romantic souls wondered if perhaps he harbored a secret passion for someone unsuitable, though none could imagine the Duke of Montrose allowing emotion to override duty. The younger ladies, those who had not yet faced his proposals, giggled behind their fans and made wagers about who would be next to refuse the increasingly notorious Duke. Georgiana knew better than all of society's gossips. She had witnessed his genuine distress when his favorite hunter, Tempest, had taken ill, watched him spend 3 nights in the stables despite his steward's protests. She observed the anonymous gifts he sent to struggling tenants, a practice he believed secret, but which she facilitated through careful accounting that disguised the charity as estate improvements. She noted the way he remembered every servant's name and the particulars of their families, inquiring after sick children and aging parents with genuine concern carefully hidden beneath formal language. The Duke of Montrose possessed a heart capable of profound feeling. He simply had never learned the art of displaying it in the manner society expected. His childhood, she had gleaned from various comments over the years, had been one of splendid isolation. Tutors who taught him to conjugate Latin verbs but not to express affection. A father lost in grief who communicated primarily through written instructions left with secretaries. A succession of guardians who ensured he knew every responsibility of his position, but none of the freedoms. Their first meeting remained vivid in Georgiana's memory. A moment that had altered the trajectory of her life in ways she could never have imagined. She had arrived at Montrose House on a gray February morning, clutching a letter of recommendation from Mr. Hartwell, the Duke's former secretary who had retired due to failing eyesight. The butler, an imposing figure named Morrison who seemed to embody the dignity of the entire aristocracy, had looked at her with barely concealed skepticism when she announced her purpose. The interview had taken place in the very study where she now spent her days. The Duke had been younger then, only 6 and 20, newly come into his title following his father's sudden death from apoplexy. He had examined her with eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail. Her modest but well-maintained dress, her proper posture that spoke of good education despite humble circumstances, her steady gaze that refused to be intimidated by his rank. His questions had been unexpected, focusing not on her experience with correspondence or accounting, skills Mr. Hartwell had assured him she possessed, but on her opinions regarding Virgil's Georgics, the implications of the Corn Laws, and whether she believed the new steam engines would revolutionize agriculture. She had answered with the honesty that necessity demanded. She could not afford to pretend knowledge she did not possess, nor could she risk appearing ignorant when she did know the answer. When he asked her about her unusual education, she had explained her father's belief that knowledge recognized no boundaries of sex or station, that a mind capable of learning should be given every opportunity to do so. The Duke had listened with an expression of intense concentration, occasionally interjecting with questions that probed deeper into her understanding. By the end of the interview, they had engaged in a spirited debate about the merits of Adam Smith's economic theories that lasted well past the appointed time. He had offered her the position on the spot, a decision that shocked his household and scandalized those members of society who learned of it. A female secretary was unusual enough. One who was young, unmarried, and not of gentle birth was unprecedented. Yet the Duke had weathered the criticism with the same indifference he showed to most social conventions that interfered with practical efficiency. Those early months had established the patterns that would define their working relationship. Georgiana learned to anticipate his needs, to prepare for his moods, to provide exactly the right reference or document at precisely the moment he required it. She discovered his preference for tea over coffee, his habit of pacing while dictating important letters, his tendency to forget meals when engrossed in particularly engaging work. The Duke, in turn, came to rely on her competence with an absoluteness that would have been flattering had it not been so clearly impersonal. He valued her intelligence, her efficiency, her ability to engage with complex ideas without requiring lengthy explanations. What he did not see, what he had never seen, was the woman beneath the professional exterior, the heart that beat faster when he entered a room, the eyes that followed him when he wasn't aware. Their daily interactions had developed a rhythm as comfortable as it was torturous for Georgiana. Morning correspondence, reviewed with their heads bent together over the desk, close enough that she could detect the sandalwood and bergamot of his cologne. Afternoon discussions of estate business, during which he would occasionally pause mid-sentence to ask her opinion, valuing her judgment on matters from crop rotation to tenant disputes. Evening work sessions that stretched beyond propriety, neither willing to end conversations that ranged from agricultural innovation to ancient history. Spring arrived in London with unusual warmth that year, transforming Hyde Park into a paradise of blooming flowers and verdant lawns. The fashionable hour saw the usual parade of society's finest, their carriages creating a slow-moving river of wealth and privilege along Rotten Row. Young ladies in their finest day dresses took carefully chaperoned turns about the park, hoping to catch the eye of eligible gentlemen who rode past on horses that cost more than most families saw in a lifetime. The social season had reached its zenith, with every night bringing multiple entertainments: balls at Devonshire House, soirees at Holland House, musical evenings at the Hanover Square Rooms, theatrical performances at Covent Garden. The Marriage Mart operated at full capacity, mothers maneuvering their daughters like generals positioning troops, fathers negotiating settlements with the cold calculation of merchant princes. In this glittering world, the Duke of Montrose's continued failures had become something of a dark entertainment, with wagers being placed in the betting books at White's about which young lady would reject him next. It was during this period that Georgiana found herself witness to more of the Duke's romantic endeavors than her heart could easily bear. He had begun requesting her assistance in matters beyond their usual purview: the selection of flowers for prospective brides, the wording of particularly delicate correspondence, even opinions on which events might provide the most advantageous opportunities for courtship. Each request twisted the knife of her hidden affection a fraction deeper, yet she fulfilled them all with the same quiet efficiency that marked every aspect of her service. She researched the favorite poets of each potential bride: Byron for the passionate Lady Emma Worthing, Wordsworth for the nature-loving Miss Penelope Ashton, Shakespeare's sonnets for the romantic Lady Diana Pembroke. She helped him craft letters that struck the perfect balance between ardent and appropriate, each word chosen to appeal to the particular sensibilities of its intended recipient. She even suggested conversation topics that might appeal to various young ladies' interests, though it pained her to imagine him discussing art with Lady Constance Harwick or music with Miss Arabella Thornton. The seventh rejection had come from Lady Patience Beaumont at the Sefton Ball. The Duke had led her to the conservatory. Conservatories had become something of a theme in his proposals, perhaps because they offered privacy while maintaining technical propriety. Lady Patience had listened to his carefully prepared speech with increasing distress before bursting into tears and fleeing, leaving the Duke standing amongst the orange trees in bewildered solitude. The eighth had been Miss Frederica Cavendish, whose rejection had been delivered with cutting precision during the intermission at the opera. They had been attending a performance of Mozart's Don Giovanni, that cautionary tale of a libertine's downfall that seemed to mock the Duke's own romantic failures. She had informed him, in words wrapped in silk but edged with steel, that while she appreciated the honor of his addresses, she could not imagine spending her life with a man who seemed to possess all the admirable qualities of character, yet lacked that divine spark of feeling that animates the true soul. To marry him, she had said with devastating clarity, would be to wed the Duchy of Montrose itself, rather than the man who bore the title. Lady Vivian Talbot had been the ninth, her refusal coming during a morning ride in Hyde Park that had been witnessed by enough of society to ensure the news spread through London before tea time. She had been kinder than Miss Cavendish, explaining that while she admired his many excellent qualities, she could not enter a marriage where affection seemed so entirely absent. The Duke had maintained perfect composure throughout her gentle speech, but Georgiana had seen the bewilderment in his eyes when he returned to Montrose House. The 10th rejection had perhaps been the most painful, coming from Lady Sarah Pemberton, whom society had considered a certain match. She was the daughter of his late father's closest friend. They had known each other since childhood, and their estates in Derbyshire shared a border. Yet when the Duke proposed during a house party at her family's estate, she had refused with tears in her eyes, telling him she loved him as a brother, but could never love him as a wife should love a husband. Through each rejection, Georgiana observed the Duke's growing confusion and frustration. He would return to his study and dissect each failed proposal like a general analyzing a lost battle, searching for the tactical error that had led to defeat. He consulted books on courtship, studied poetry he clearly found incomprehensible, even engaged a dancing master to ensure his performance at balls was beyond reproach, though he had always been an accomplished dancer. What he could not see, what Georgiana witnessed with agonizing clarity, was that his approach to love bore all the hallmarks of his approach to estate management. He researched each potential bride as thoroughly as he would investigate a new agricultural technique. He prepared his proposals with the same meticulous attention he gave to parliamentary speeches. He executed his romantic gestures with mechanical precision, each flower, each word, each setting chosen for maximum effect rather than genuine feeling. During this period, their evening work sessions became both sanctuary and torture for Georgiana. The Duke would often abandon the pretense of estate business, instead ruminating on his failures with an openness that suggested he had forgotten she was a woman and saw her only as a sympathetic ear. He would pace before the fireplace, his shadow dancing on the walls, wondering aloud what quality he lacked that made him so universally unacceptable as a husband. These moments of vulnerability revealed depths to his character that society never witnessed. She saw his genuine desire for companionship, his longing for the kind of partnership his own parents had never demonstrated. He spoke of visiting friends' estates and observing married couples who seemed to exist in perfect harmony, finishing each other's sentences, sharing private smiles across crowded rooms. He wanted that connection, that understanding, but had no conception of how to achieve it. Georgiana offered what comfort she could within the bounds of propriety, suggesting that perhaps he sought love in hearts that valued different qualities than those he possessed in abundance. When he asked what she meant, she carefully explained that his intellectual brilliance, his dedication to duty, his integrity in business matters, these qualities might appeal more to a woman who shared his interests rather than one who had been raised to value only social graces and romantic gestures. The 12th rejection arrived in the form of Lady Margaret Ashford, and it marked a turning point in more ways than one. The proposal had taken place at the Ashford Ball in the conservatory amongst exotic orchids that had been imported at tremendous expense from the Americas. The setting was perfection itself, moonlight streaming through glass panels, the air heavy with perfume, a small fountain providing gentle music in the background. The Ashford Conservatory was renowned throughout the region as an ambitious testament to botanical passion. Lord Ashford had spent years creating this glass sanctuary, importing rare specimens from distant colonies with great expense and difficulty. Orchids from the Indies bloomed alongside exotic ferns, while the warm air, carefully maintained by an elaborate system of coal stoves hidden behind decorative screens, created a haven from the English spring chill. The moonlight filtered through hundreds of glass panes, creating patterns of light and shadow that transformed the space into something almost magical. Lady Margaret herself was everything society deemed perfection in a potential duchess. At 22, she possessed the kind of beauty that inspired poets to reach for increasingly elaborate metaphors. Skin like alabaster, eyes like sapphires, hair spun from moonbeams. Her accomplishments were equally impressive. She painted watercolors that had been displayed at the Royal Academy, played the harp with such skill that professional musicians acknowledged her superiority, and could converse knowledgeably on subjects ranging from classical literature to natural philosophy. Her dowry included not merely money, but connections to half the crowned heads of Europe through her mother's Byzantine family tree. The Duke had prepared for this proposal with even more than his usual meticulous attention. He had commissioned a poem from a celebrated author, memorized it perfectly, and practiced his delivery until every inflection was calculated for maximum romantic effect. He had arranged for Lady Margaret's favorite flowers, white camellias symbolizing perfect loveliness, to be placed throughout the conservatory. He had even consulted with her modiste, secretly commissioning a betrothal gift of a bracelet designed to perfectly complement her signature shade of celestial blue. His Grace had returned to Montrose House that evening in a state Georgiana had never witnessed before. Rather than controlled frustration or bewildered hurt, he exhibited a kind of resigned defeat that was far more alarming. He entered the study where she was working late, a common occurrence during the season when correspondence accumulated at an alarming rate, and slumped into the chair before the fireplace with none of his usual regard for posture or dignity. For a long moment, neither spoke. Georgiana continued her work, giving him time to collect himself, though every instinct screamed at her to offer comfort. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He told her of Lady Margaret's rejection, but more than that, he revealed what she had said that differed from all the others. Lady Margaret, it seemed, had been brutally honest. She told him that every young lady in London knew of his proposals, that they had become something of a legend. Each one followed the same pattern: perfect setting, perfect words, perfect execution, and absolutely no genuine feeling. She had compared him to an actor performing a role, hitting every mark, delivering every line, but never truly inhabiting the character. Until he could offer real emotion rather than performed romance, she advised, he would continue to face rejection, regardless of his wealth or title. The conversation that followed stripped away 5 years of careful pretense. The Duke spoke of his childhood with more detail than ever before. The mother who died bringing him into the world, the father who looked at him and saw only the cause of his beloved wife's death. He had been raised by servants who were kind but careful, tutors who were brilliant but cold, guardians who ensured he knew everything about being a duke except how to be human. He had learned to manage vast estates, to navigate parliamentary politics, to command respect through competence and authority. But no one had ever taught him how to express affection, how to be vulnerable, how to let another person truly see him. He had studied love like a foreign language, memorizing the vocabulary and grammar, but never understanding the culture that gave it meaning. As he spoke, Georgiana found herself moving closer, drawn by his pain despite every proprietary instinct. She settled in the chair across from him, the firelight casting shadows that obscured the impropriety of the late hour, the intimate setting, the dangerous territory their conversation approached. The fire had burned low, casting the room in amber shadows that softened the harsh lines of the Duke's face, making him appear younger, more vulnerable. The usual sounds of the household had long since faded. The servants retired to their quarters, the great house settling into its nighttime quiet, leaving them in a cocoon of solitude that felt both dangerous and precious. When he looked at her directly, truly looked at her for perhaps the first time, she saw not the Duke of Montrose but Christopher, lost, lonely, desperately wanting something he didn't know how to find. In that moment, she understood with painful clarity that beneath his ducal armor was a man who had never been allowed to be merely human. Every moment of his life had been shaped by expectation and duty, until he no longer knew where the Duke ended and the man began. Without thinking, she spoke from her heart rather than her head. She told him that love could not be learned from books or performed like a play. It grew from shared experiences, from understanding built over time, from seeing someone's true self and choosing to stay despite the imperfections. She spoke of the small moments that built affection, a shared laugh over an amusing passage in a book, comfortable silence that needed no filling, the security of knowing someone well enough to predict their needs. As she spoke, something shifted in his expression. He leaned forward, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. He asked her how she knew these things, this woman who, as far as he knew, had never been courted, never been in love. The question hung between them, dangerous and charged with possibility. Georgiana retreated into safer territory, speaking of observations rather than experience. of books she had read and couples she had observed. But the Duke was not so easily diverted. He pressed further, asking if she had ever felt the kind of connection she described, if she had ever known someone well enough to predict their thoughts, to find comfort in their presence, to feel incomplete in their absence. The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious. Georgiana knew she stood at a precipice. One word, one look, one gesture could reveal everything she had hidden for 5 years. But the gulf between them remained vast. She was a merchant's daughter, his employee, completely unsuitable by every measure society used. So she deflected, turning the conversation back to his situation, offering suggestions for how he might approach future courtships differently. But something had changed that night, something fundamental and irreversible. The Duke began to see her not as an efficient secretary, but as a woman of intelligence and feeling. He noticed things he had overlooked for 5 years. The way lamplight caught gold threads in her brown hair, the expressiveness of her hands when she spoke of something that engaged her passion, the musical quality of her laugh on the rare occasions when he managed to amuse her. The arrival of the Dowager Duchess of Montrose shattered the delicate understanding that had begun to develop between them. Her grace swept into Grosvenor Square with the force of a military campaign, her traveling coach followed by 2 others containing her extensive wardrobe and regiment of servants. The procession had caused quite a sensation on the fashionable street, neighbors peering from behind curtains to witness the return of one of society's most formidable matriarchs. She had come, she announced within moments of her arrival, to address her nephew's matrimonial failures with characteristic decisiveness. The announcement was made in the entrance hall with such volume and authority that every servant in the house heard it, ensuring the news would spread through the servants' network across Mayfair before tea time. The Dowager was a force of nature, a woman who had ruled society for 40 years through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. She had married the 8th Duke when she was 17, produced the requisite heir and spare within 3 years of marriage, and then proceeded to make herself indispensable to every political and social movement of significance. Her husband's early death from a hunting accident had only increased her power, as she ruled as regent over the vast Montrose holdings until her son came of age, and continued to wield influence even after he assumed the title. Now, at 70, she remained formidable, her silver hair arranged in elaborate coiffures that required 2 hours and 3 maids to achieve. Her dark eyes, so like her nephew's, missing nothing. She dressed exclusively in purple and black, colors that emphasized her position as a wealthy widow while allowing her to stand out in any gathering. Her jewelry collection was legendary, each piece with its own history and strategic purpose, deployed like weapons in the social wars she continued to wage. She had arranged, she announced at dinner that first evening, a house party at the Derbyshire estate. The guests had been carefully selected, young ladies of impeccable breeding who had not yet rejected him, their mothers who were sympathetic to the ducal cause, and a selection of gentlemen to provide camouflage for what was essentially a marriage mart in miniature. The Duke's protests were swept aside with imperious certainty. But the Dowager's investigations had uncovered more than just suitable brides. Through her network of informants, ladies' maids, footmen, the invisible army that actually ran aristocratic households, she had learned of the unusual relationship between the Duke and his secretary. That a young, unmarried woman spent hours alone with his grace, that she had been seen at various venues delivering documents at inappropriate hours, that he trusted her with responsibilities far beyond her station. All of this had been noted and reported. The confrontation came 3 days after her arrival. Georgiana was summoned to the drawing room, where she found the Dowager seated like a queen, granting audience. The older woman examined her with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey, taking in every detail from her modest dress to her steady posture. The drawing room had been rearranged for this meeting, the Dowager positioned in the largest chair with the light from the windows behind her, creating an effect that was deliberately intimidating. Even the portraits on the walls seemed to look down with disapproval, generations of Montrose duchesses judging this merchant's daughter who had dared to enter their domain. The Dowager began her assault with deceptive pleasantry, commenting on the weather, the state of the London roads, the quality of this year's debutantes. It was a technique Georgiana had observed in her employer, the calm before the storm, the careful positioning before the fatal strike. When the attack came, it was swift and merciless. The dowager's words were precise and cutting. She understood, she said, that Miss Sinclair had been invaluable to her nephew's business affairs. However, the unusual nature of their arrangement was beginning to attract attention. There were whispers, suggestions of impropriety that, while entirely unfounded, here the dowager's tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of this, could damage the Duke's prospects for a suitable marriage. Furthermore, the incident at the auction house had not gone unnoticed. A young woman, bidding on the Duke's behalf, spending extraordinary sums with apparent authority, it had caused considerable speculation. Some suggested she was a foreign princess acting as agent. Others, that she was secretly engaged to the Duke. While these rumors were obviously ridiculous, they nevertheless existed and needed to be addressed. The solution, the dowager announced, was simple. Miss Sinclair would tender her resignation, citing family obligations that required her presence elsewhere. She would be provided with an excellent reference and a generous severance that would allow her to establish herself respectably somewhere far from London. The Duke would hire a proper secretary, male, older, and utterly unremarkable. Everyone's reputation would remain intact. Georgiana listened to this decree with outward calm while her world crumbled internally. She had always known her position was precarious, that the unusual arrangement could not last forever. But to have it end like this, with cold calculation and social expedience, was more painful than she had imagined. She agreed to the dowager's terms. What choice did she have? And promised to submit her resignation immediately. What neither woman knew was that the Duke had heard every word. He had been in his study, the door slightly ajar, when his aunt's voice had carried through. He heard her threaten the woman who had been his intellectual companion for 5 years, who had understood him better than any of the perfect ladies he had pursued, who had shown him what genuine connection could look like, even if he had been too blind to recognize it. The realization hit him with the force of physical blow. All those evenings discussing philosophy and agriculture, all those mornings working in comfortable harmony, all those moments when her presence had made the loneliness of his position bearable. He had attributed it to her professional competence when it had been something far more precious. He had searched for love in ballrooms and conservatories when it had been sitting across from him in his study, patient and constant and unrecognized. But before he could act on this revelation, Georgiana was gone. She left her resignation on his desk that night, along with detailed notes about ongoing correspondence and estate matters that would need attention. By dawn, she had vacated her rooms in Montrose House, leaving no forwarding address, no means of contact. She simply vanished, as efficiently as she had done everything else. The Duke's search for Georgiana consumed 3 weeks and revealed the depths of his previous blindness. He discovered, through increasingly desperate inquiries, how little he actually knew about the woman who had been central to his life for 5 years. He knew her opinions on Virgil and her thoughts on agricultural innovation, but not where she might go when fleeing a broken heart. His investigator finally tracked her to a respectable boarding house in Bloomsbury, where she had taken rooms while arranging a position as governess to a merchant family in Manchester. The distance was deliberate, far enough from London to avoid any chance encounters, respectable enough to maintain her dignity, permanent enough to suggest she had no intention of returning. During those 3 weeks, the Duke had experienced an education in loss that no tutor had ever provided. He discovered that his perfectly organized study became chaos without her presence. But more than the disorder of papers and correspondence, he found himself haunted by the absence of small, intimate details he had never consciously noticed before. The silence of his study, once a refuge, now felt oppressive without the soft scratch of her pen against paper. He missed not merely her opinions on Virgil, but the way a small line of concentration would form between her brows when debating a particularly complex point. The subtle scent of lavender and ink that had always accompanied her presence had vanished, leaving the air sterile and lifeless. His new secretary, the properly male, properly old, properly boring Mr. Pemberton, was competent but uninspiring. There were no debates about ancient philosophy, no shared excitement over new agricultural techniques, no quiet companionship that made the burden of his position bearable. Mr. Pemberton never challenged his opinions, never offered unexpected insights, never filled the silences with observations that made him see the world differently. More than that, he found himself seeing her everywhere. A woman's laugh in the park that made him turn, hoping irrationally that she had returned. The particular way morning light fell across an empty chair. Books in his library with her neat annotations in the margins. Observations that made him smile even as they intensified his loss. He discovered notes she had left for his future reference, reminders about tenants' birthdays, observations about which merchants offered the best value, small kindnesses she had performed that he had never acknowledged. He had not merely lost an employee, he had lost his closest friend, his intellectual equal, the person who knew him better than he knew himself. It was during this period of searching that fate intervened in the form of a crisis. A child's scream pierced the morning quiet in Hyde Park, followed by a splash that sent every nearby person running toward the Serpentine. A young boy had fallen through a weak spot in the ornamental bridge's railing, his heavy clothes dragging him under the dark water. Georgiana, who had been taking a final walk through the park before her departure to Manchester, didn't hesitate. She plunged into the lake, her own heavy skirts immediately becoming a liability. She reached the child through sheer determination, supporting his head above water while fighting against the weight of their combined clothing. Just as her strength began to fail, strong arms pulled them both to shore. Her rescuer was none other than Lord Hartley, the collector renowned for his vast library. He had been riding along the Serpentine when he witnessed her brave plunge into the water. As he pulled both Georgiana and the child to safety, he recognized in her the same fierce determination he had observed in the Duke of Montrose's most trusted advisor, for her reputation as an unusually capable secretary had not gone unnoticed among the Duke's acquaintances. The child's mother, arriving in hysterics, was revealed to be Lady Pemberton, one of society's most influential hostesses. Her gratitude was effusive and public, declaring Georgiana a heroine before the assembled crowd. The story spread through London's drawing rooms like wildfire. Within hours, everyone knew of Miss Sinclair, who had saved young Master Pemberton, who served as the Duke of Montrose's invaluable secretary, who possessed courage and intelligence that transcended her humble origins. The narrative that emerged painted her not as a mere employee, but as a woman of unusual character, precisely the sort of person a wise man would trust with matters of importance. By evening, when Georgiana finally escaped Pemberton House after being feted as a heroine, she found the boarding house in chaos. The Duke of Montrose had arrived an hour prior, in a state the landlady described as quite wild. He had commandeered the small parlor and was pacing before the fireplace with an energy that seemed to electrify the air itself. When she entered, he turned, and the expression on his face, relief, anger, desperation, and something else entirely, stopped her at the threshold. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the Duke exploded into speech, words tumbling over each other in his haste to explain, to apologize, to confess. He had been a fool, he said, the worst kind of fool who looked for spectacle when he should have valued substance. He had pursued ladies who fit society's definition of perfect matches, while ignoring the woman who perfectly matched him in every way that mattered. He had spent 5 years taking her presence for granted, assuming she would always be there, never recognizing that what he felt for her transcended employment or even friendship. Georgiana tried to protest, to speak of propriety and social expectations, but he overrode her with passionate intensity unlike anything she had witnessed from him before. "Society be damned," he declared. His aunt could disinherit him, the ton could cut him, the gossips could say whatever they pleased. He had spent 31 years living according to others' expectations, and it had brought him nothing but loneliness and rejection. When Georgiana continued to resist, speaking of the damage to his reputation, the impossibility of a merchant's daughter becoming a duchess, he did something that shocked them both. He dropped to one knee in that shabby parlor, taking her hand with trembling fingers. The boarding house residents, who had been shamelessly eavesdropping, gasped collectively at the sight of the proud Duke of Montrose kneeling on their worn carpet. His proposal, the 13th by anyone's count, bore no resemblance to its predecessors. There were no rehearsed speeches about duty and mutual benefit, no carefully orchestrated romantic gestures, no perfect setting with moonlight and roses. Instead, he spoke with halting honesty about mornings that felt empty without her presence, about conversations he stored in memory to share with her, about the realization that every achievement felt incomplete unless she knew of it. He spoke of love not as a grand passion from novels and poetry, but as daily choice, the decision to share one's thoughts, fears, and hopes with another person. He admitted he had been blind, searching for lightning when he should have recognized the steady flame that had burned beside him for years. He offered not just his title and wealth, but his imperfect self, promising only that he would spend his remaining days trying to be worthy of her affection. He told her of the 3 weeks without her, how they had taught him that his life without her was not merely inconvenient, but unbearable. He had realized that every important conversation of the past 5 years had been with her. Every moment of genuine happiness had involved her presence. Every hope for the future had unconsciously included her. She was not just his secretary, or even his friend. She was his heart's true companion, the one person who knew him completely and somehow loved him anyway. The tears that had threatened throughout his speech finally escaped Georgiana's control. Through them, she saw not the Duke of Montrose, but Christopher, the man who had shared his fears in moonlight, who had trusted her with his failures, who had unknowingly held her heart for so long she could not remember not loving him. She told him of that afternoon discussing crop rotation when she had first recognized her feelings, of the agony of helping him court others, of the joy and torture of their evening conversations. Her acceptance was barely audible, but his expression suggested he had heard nothing clearer in his life. When he rose and pulled her into an embrace that thoroughly violated every principle of propriety, neither cared that the boarding house residents had gathered at the door to witness the scene. The kiss that followed was neither practiced nor perfect, but it contained 5 years of suppressed longing and a lifetime of promise. The scandal, when it broke, was indeed significant. The Duke of Montrose, who had been rejected by 12 perfect ladies, had chosen to marry his secretary, a merchant's daughter with no connections worth noting. Society was aghast, then intrigued, then ultimately charmed by the obvious devotion between the couple. Lady Pemberton, wielding her influence with strategic precision, championed the match as evidence of the Duke's excellent judgment. After all, she noted, he had trusted Miss Sinclair with his most important business affairs. Why should he not trust her with his heart? The wedding took place 6 weeks later at the estate chapel in Derbyshire, a modest affair by ducal standards, but perfect in its intimacy. The Dowager Duchess, faced with her nephew's absolute determination and Georgiana's obvious intelligence, had grudgingly accepted the match. The bride wore a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to the Duke's mother, altered to fit her perfectly. The groom, who had faced 12 rejections with stoic control, wept openly as his bride walked toward him. The wedding breakfast was held in the portrait gallery, where generations of Montroses looked down upon the unprecedented addition to their line. The gallery stretched the entire length of the house's east wing, its walls covered in portraits dating back to the first Duke, who had earned his title fighting for Charles II. Each portrait told a story of power, privilege, and strategic marriages that had built the Montrose fortune. Now, among these august ancestors, stood Georgiana, the merchant's daughter who had won not through bloodline or fortune, but through 5 years of patient devotion and genuine understanding. The breakfast itself was a study in contrasts. The Dowager Duchess, having grudgingly accepted the match when faced with her nephew's absolute determination, had insisted on maintaining certain standards. The table groaned under the weight of silver and crystal. The wedding cake towered 5 tiers high, decorated with sugarwork so fine it seemed impossible human hands had created it. Yet the atmosphere was warm rather than formal. The gentle clink of silver against porcelain mingled with genuine laughter, creating a harmony that surprised everyone. The guests, a mixture of the Duke's progressive friends and Georgiana's small circle of acquaintances, found common ground in their shared joy for the couple, their conversations flowing as freely as the champagne. Lord Hartley gave a toast that brought tears to many eyes. Speaking of the moment he witnessed her extraordinary courage at the Serpentine, when she had not hesitated to risk her own life for a child she did not know, a bravery that surpassed that of many men born to nobility. He confessed that he had long heard of her remarkable intelligence through his acquaintance with the Duke, but witnessing her selfless action had proven that Miss Sinclair possessed not merely a brilliant mind, but a noble heart. Lady Pemberton spoke of the rescue of her son, but more than that, of witnessing true love triumph over convention. Even the Dowager, in her brief remarks, acknowledged that her nephew had chosen with his heart rather than his head, and perhaps that was not the disaster she had initially believed. Indeed, the Dowager, ever the strategist, had recognized that Lady Pemberton's unwavering support transformed what might have been a socially questionable union into something approaching a coup de maître. The Duke's speech broke with tradition entirely, ignoring the usual platitudes about duty and lineage to speak instead of finding treasure where one least expected it, of the difference between performing love and living it, of the joy of being truly known and loved, not despite one's flaws, but including them. He spoke of the 13 proposals, causing gentle laughter among the guests, and declared that he had needed 12 failures to recognize that success had been beside him all along. As autumn turned the Derbyshire hills gold and crimson, the Duke and Duchess of Montrose could often be seen walking the grounds together, deep in conversation that ranged from crop yields to classical philosophy. The servants noted that His Grace smiled more in a day than he previously had in a year, while Her Grace brought an efficiency to household management that made their positions remarkably secure. The library became their sanctuary, evening after evening spent in comfortable companionship, reading aloud or debating the merits of various texts. The Duke had a second desk installed, identical to his own, positioned so they could work together or separately as the mood took them. Occasionally, he would look up from his book to find his Duchess watching him with an expression of such contentment that his heart would tighten with emotion he was finally learning to express. Society gradually accepted what it could not change. The Duchess of Montrose might not have been born to the purple, but she conducted herself with a dignity and intelligence that won even harsh critics. Her salon became famous for bringing together people of talent, regardless of birth, where merchants discussed art with marquises and scientists debated with statesmen. The Duke's obvious adoration of his wife became legendary, a complete reversal of his former cold demeanor that suggested the right woman could indeed transform a man. The following spring brought news that set society's tongues wagging once more. The Duchess of Montrose was expecting their first child, and the Duke's protective devotion reached levels that bordered on the absurd. When their son arrived, healthy, loud, and possessing his father's dark hair and his mother's observant eyes, the sight of the 9th Duke of Montrose weeping over his infant heir while declaring his wife the most remarkable woman in England became another piece of the legend. Years later, when their children asked about their unusual courtship, the Duchess would smile and remind them that the best things in life often came disguised as ordinary moments. Their father had proposed 12 times to women who seemed perfect on paper, but paper was a poor substitute for genuine understanding. The 13th proposal had succeeded not because it was perfect, but because it was real, offered to someone who had already proven her love through 5 years of patient devotion. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society. The Duke of Montrose had failed 12 times, not because he was incapable of love, but because his heart, wiser than his head, had already made its choice. It simply took him rather longer than it should have to notice that everything he sought in a duchess, intelligence, loyalty, understanding, and yes, love, had been organizing his library and managing his correspondence for 5 faithful years.